Beyond scaring kids straight, being the ending of a CSI episode, or serving as the backdrop for a heartwarming and totally not whitewashing a lot of racism, critically acclaimed movies taking place in the 1930s, what is prison good for? Well, to a lot of people, wasting money and traumatizing. For others, it's the perfect way to punish crimes and get people good and ready to enter society by surrounding them with criminals while locked inside a box. And others still see prison as not harsh enough, thinking that we should go back to the days where stealing a loaf of bread could get your arm ripped out of its socket by a mule. But regardless, what's the realities of the prison system? What's actually wrong? And does prison even really work? On this episode of Why Aren't You Talking About This? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Why Aren't You Talking About This? I am your host, William, and I will be guiding you through the fucked up and uncomfortably not too dissimilar to being a freed American justice system. And as always, thank you for listening. It means a lot to me that I'm in your ears or whatever other orifices you pump my voice into. It still means the world, regardless of what kind of feeling you're getting out of this. You horny fucker. Alright, and this week I want to remind you all to download this episode and all of your other favorite episodes. I know, none of my episodes are your favorite episode, and also you prefer streaming, but it's the only way for a podcast as new as mine to track who's actually listening. That or emails or Twitter followers, but the downloads are the fastest to track on my hosting site of choice. But anyways, enough of that. Let's just get right into the show. Alright, so we are going to talk all about prison this week. Well, not all about it. You shouldn't be using this show as a Library of Alexandria or anything. It's literally just one fucking nerd with too much free time making an internet show so that he doesn't have to work eventually. But before I get existential about my place in reality, what is a prison? Well, a prison is a building, usually a secure one, where people are held against their will either as punishment for a crime or while awaiting their trial. And while this sounds simple, if you've been listening for a while, you'd know that reality is unfortunately a bit more complicated than Big Dictionary wants you to believe. Also, that was my nickname in college. I think a good place to start would be the purpose of prison. And no, not putting minorities into the modern equivalent of slavery using the excuse of criminality to continue to be systematically racist. That's the current purpose. What's the idea behind prisons? Well, this is broken down into 4 distinct reasons to use a prison system. The first is as a deterrent. Basically, by having a prison system and the means to fill it, you tell the public, listen up, motherfucker. The Constitution won't have jack shit to help you if you fuck around, find out, and end up in the box. The idea being that if you threaten the public with a very bad time, they're less likely to commit crime because they're terrified. And it's meant to deter future crimes performed by ex-cons by reminding them that the prison system can spank them for a second time if they didn't learn their lesson the first time. The second reason is as a punishment. Essentially, the prison itself isn't meant to do anything but put baby in a corner and think about its actions. Because as we all know, having your freedoms non-consensually taken away from you by Father Samuel fucking sucks. In this reasoning, prison isn't a way to deter future crimes necessarily, but society and the government taking from you something you love because it took away something it loves. So, revenge, but with extra steps. Third is an opportunity at personal reform. The idea here is that by picking you up and dropping you in the bad box for a few years, you get a chance to look at your life and realize that you're really fucking it up. Here, you're basically getting out of the rat race to figure out what the fuck you actually want, get a chance to get off any drugs you're on, and then get put back into society with a friendly smack on the ass and a new lease on life. And under this reasoning, you'd hopefully never be coming back. And finally is protection. Prison can essentially be used to protect the public from a violent offender that can't stop, won't stop, or just so much of an asshole that they refuse to stop committing atrocities against man, God, and nature for more than 5 seconds. But at the same time, it can be used to protect the people on the inside from people who want to kill them or from their own problems. By putting these people in the box, you also stop this drug dealer's MLM of crack cocaine boss from removing their bones from their butthole. And obviously, these theoretical ideas of how prison works is great. But when you remember how the prison system works in the real world, these start sounding like it was written by a dystopian civilization minister of propaganda. So, prison is meant to intimidate us with the threat of getting motherfucking waffle stomped by the government into being good boys. And if we don't do it, we get put into the Traumatizer 9000, the name of my dildo, by the way, and told to think about our actions, and they better not see us again and expect us to come out wearing a suit and tie, ready to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And sometimes it's for our own good. But I mean, before we really get into that too much, let's look real quick at how the prison system is organized in the US. The BOP, Federal Bureau of Prisons, which has the worst fucking information on how something works I've ever found, by the way, oversees and is responsible for the care, custody, and control of everyone who committed a federal crime. But William, I hear you say, why is it specifically a federal crime? Aren't all crimes in the United States federal crimes because it's the same government? And, oh, my sweet summer child, you must be new here. See, because it's the US, the entire system is more fucked than I wish I was. In a sexual way. I am already pretty fucked up. But no, the government is a piece of shit that barely functions, so obviously instead of overseeing every prison, this agency called the Bureau of Prisons only oversees the ones that the federal government itself opened. All other prisons are under the supervision and jurisdiction of the state it's in. Every state has its own legal code that it is responsible for enforcing. If you know the moral differences between a place like, say, California, Alabama, you'd understand why this fucking sucks and doesn't make any sense and is stupid. So, at the top of the system are the BOP and the State Departments of Corrections. All 50 of them. But, when you're getting processed by the prison system, you're going to arrive first at jail. Jails are places to temporarily confine people for a short period of time, and are people that are generally awaiting either a trial or sentencing for their crime. This is also where you put when you get arrested, being processed into a jail cell. And often, if someone is sentenced to less than a year, a jail is also where they're going to serve your time. So if you're following, the kinds of people being put in jail are people suspected of being an asshole, someone who just got arrested for being a fucking menace in public, and Karens that refuse to leave the Walmart for trying to spit on employees, all next to people who have gone to trial but not sentenced, and dudes that did something but aren't being held for very long. Which is a whole lot to try and sort through when you're putting people in cells. But the next step up is the processing units, or prisoner intake facilities. Assuming you're serving more than a year, you're brought from jail on a bus to another facility where you're put into this huge dorm space to await being sent to a facility to serve your time. And this can sometimes take upwards of a year. And everyone who goes to prison comes here. Which, fucking yikes. Imagine being the person going to prison for some minor defrauding the government like a fucking hero, and the two people across the hall from you at this intake facility both ate a man's liver. Independently, by the way, they didn't work together. But once you're tested, given shots, and assessed for brain problems and other fun things that will totally not determine your fate for the next unknown number of years, you get sent to a prison of one of 5 security levels. But first, it's important to distinguish the difference between state and federal prisons. A state prison holds people that commit crimes that occur only within that one state and only affect that state or otherwise not considered a national issue. So this is for your tame stuff, like fucking murder, rape, arson, and robbery. And states have a very wide range of options to punish these crimes, but these punishments are handled at state-run prisons. Federal prisons, however, are for federal crimes like tax evasion, interstate crimes, and stuff that's a big deal to the government like human and drug trafficking. And federal prisons are the ones that more often use the security levels, but a lot of state prisons I've found use similar categories if they're not exactly the same. So the lowest level is creatively called minimum security. I mean, who'd fucking guess, right? But these facilities hold nonviolent offenders on their first time offenses, and because of that, don't really have any high tech security things, or usually even fences or clear signs of being a prison in the first place. They usually look more like a set of government offices or a college campus than what you'd expect from a prison, and are mostly about rehabilitation rather than actually trying to make you miserable. The next level is low security, and holy shit, the creativity is leaving me stunned. These places will usually have something called double fences, which is not two fences stacked on top of each other like a Minecraft build, but is a fence with a little gap and then another fence to make clearing them both take a lot more time. They also usually have more staff and are meant for low risk offenders as a chance to reform. This includes people that aren't likely to commit the crime again, but might or literally only made a mistake and were white enough for the judge to believe them. Whoops, slipped the quiet part again. Now, low security will also usually house either prisoners with some capacity for violence or serving more than 20 years on a non-violent sentence. Third and middle of the road is medium security. These prisons have much higher levels of security and might even do things like be way out in the middle of the fucking desert, be surrounded by cement security walls, or other definitely unique ways of keeping people from going places you don't want them to be. These prisons are mostly for punishment and containment, but a lot of them will still have options to reform. But I mean, like, high schools offering shop classes as a form of job training. But, hey, it's still something. And most of the people here would either be repeat offenders or people believed to have a high-ish chance to be violent. I say high-ish because of that totally a joke from the last century of non-white people usually not going to low-security prisons. A lot of people that are minority populations are more likely to get sent to medium security because of racism. Fourth are high security facilities, which are for highly dangerous inmates or high risk of reoffending inmates, or both. Usually both. High security prisons are also highly secure, hence the name, with prison defense systems that you see in prison break shows and movies. Medium security and below isn't going to have an automatic sewer line sealing system that prevents people from escaping prison during shower time. No joke, that is a prison security thing I saw on a TV show, and it's lived rent-free since then, that if someone took an especially long shower at that prison, you could clog every shit pipe at once. But these places aren't usually focused on rehabilitation and will very rarely have options for people to get out legally. So they're usually more about detainment and punishment than actually helping anyone. And finally, not maximum security, are administrative prisons. Fucking wild, right? Only changed up the naming sequence in the last one. But anyways, administrative prisons are basically all these special case prisons. These are generally for extremely dangerous and escape-happy prisoners used as a punishment, or are prisons designed with a specific accessibility or health need in mind. Like a prison specifically for people with mobility problems, or one for people going through chemo. Which, yeah, that's as depressing as it sounds. Now, to get even more depressing for a moment, we do also have child prisons. And no, not Planned Parenthood, Texas, nice try. Actual prisons where we traumatize children with largely the same issues with the juvenile system as there is for the adult system. But these places are meant to treat and contain children who have committed crimes where them being around other children isn't seen as too dangerous or particularly cruel. Meaning this is skipped when it's something like a 14-year-old child molester or a baby murderer. Alright, so let's go over the numbers. Well, it's hard to say for sure, given how fucky-wucky the US systems for keeping track of prisons is. The estimated number of prisons and other detention centers in the US is 4,455, with a total prison population of 1,675,400 people, of a total prison capacity of 2,163,235 people. Now, if you didn't know, this is a fuck ton of people. An estimated 505 in 100,000, or 1.01 in 200 people, are imprisoned in the US, and the budget for containment and imprisonment alone, not including the rest of the justice system, is $80.7 billion. And all of this puts us at number one for incarceration. See, we're number one at something besides school shootings and giving our money to the military-industrial complex. But also, there are a total of 11.6 million prisoners in the entire world, meaning that we have 14% of all prisoners in the world. Yep. Makes you want to sing the national anthem, doesn't it? But now, what do these prisoners actually look like? Well, 93.1% of all prisoners are male, and 6.9%, nice, are female. Age-wise, 0.9% of all prisoners are 18 to 21, 4.6 are up to 25, 11.8% up to 30, 16.9% to 35, 17.6 to 40, 16.8 to 45, 11.9 to 50, 8.1 to 55, and then 11.4 are over the age of 60. And racially, prisons are 1.4% Asian, 38.5% Black, 2.6% Native American, and 57.5% white. And of that, 69.8%, nice, I guess, are non-Hispanic. For their sentence, 2.1% are in for less than a year, 9.8% are in for up to 3 years, 9.6% for up to 5, 25.6% are serving between 5 and 10 years, 22.6% up to 15, 12.7% up to 20 years, and 17.6% are in for 20 to life. Life in this case is a specific sentence that means 25 years or until paroled. And finally, of these inmates, let's look over their crimes. So 0.1% commit a money crime, being things like embezzlement. 4.9% commit property offenses like theft. 0.2% commit organized crime, which I don't think I really need to explain that one. 0.4% perform some kind of correctional infraction, meaning they broke the terms of their parole or probation, which is kind of bullshit, but okay. 44.8% committed a drug crime. 4.4% did something like extortion or fraud. 3.2% committed murder, kidnapping, or assault. 5.1% are being held for immigration crimes like overstaying their visa, which is also kind of fucked up. 2.8% are convicted on robbery, 12% on sex crimes, and 21.7% on weapons violations or arson, and then 0.5% for literally every other crime there is on the books. Oh, and also I think there are... Let me look again real quick. I believe that there are 41 people in prison for national security crimes. Yep, 41 people in prison for national security crimes. But anyways, looking at all this, what is the most common kind of prisoner? It is a white man, somewhere in his late 30s, serving 5 to 10 years for making just a little bit too much meth. And the least common? A 20-year-old Asian woman serving less than a year on money crimes. Which sounds like a character introduction. I can't really explain why. But you might expect me to be simping right now, but money crimes aren't violent. And also are usually just writing something wrong intentionally, so I'm not really. Alright, moving on before you start to worry about me. Don't worry, I'm fine. We're talking about how long people serve for the 10 most common offenses. In first place is murder at 17.5 years, rape at 7.2 years, intentional manslaughter at 7 years, negligent manslaughter at 3.7 years, sexual assault at 3.6 years, robbery at 3.2 years, assault, burglary, and drug trafficking are all tied at 1.4 years, and weapon sentences are at about 1.3 years. And what is the average amount of time that someone will spend in actual prison? 2.7 years. Yep, on average, regardless of what you do, you can expect to spend somewhere around 82 months in prison, which is surprisingly short. So then, why is prison such a big deal in the US? I mean, besides the racism and high incarceration numbers and stuff. Well, I think a good place to start to actually discuss that would be the history of the prison system. So, let's go to that. Alright, and we start all the way back in the 3rd millennium BC, because prison is basically as old as the ideas of cities, civilization, laws, and being an asshole. And because of this early time, a lot of punishments were usually pretty public, quick, and painful. Prisons were more used to make sure that the person you want to be within an inch of their life doesn't very reasonably run away. And a lot of civilizations around at this time used fairly simple techniques like a locked door and a guard in a windowless room to be basically the most secure prison cell available. Because they didn't really need to be worried about long term security. But this started to shift and change until by the 1st millennium BC, prisons became something officially used as a punishment and storage place. In a lot of parts of the world, prisons became holding areas you specifically have for people you're about to fucking butcher for a public audience. Because generally speaking, these are the people most likely to try and escape, and most likely to succeed since, they could fucking die. And it's a little hard to hold them down until you decide how you want to do it and someone willing to stab the shit out of someone unarmed who isn't also being executed. But they were also used quite a lot as places to hold slaves or soon to be slaves. See, in systems where crimes could be punished with slavery, you need a place to store these people. And obviously, you don't want them around the other slaves that you have generationally crushed the hope out of, so it became necessary to have places specifically designed for holding them. But at the same time, in places like ancient Greece, confinement in prison could also be a punishment for a crime in and of itself, with people like Plato even suggesting that if you're put in confinement, you get a break from life and are able to get a handle on your own brain so you can jump back in and fix yourself. He also suggested that maybe you could serve time in prison to pay off debts, but yikes. And as you'd expect, the Romans copied this, but being Romans and needing a fresh pile of corpses and slaves basically 24/7 to be the villains of the ancient world, they also did the whole enslaved for your crimes thing. And all of these 1st millennium developments led to the development of a new prison design. Because you had a lot more people in prisons and for longer, you couldn't just lock them in the broom closet for naughty children until you need to make them a corpse. So it became really common to use underground structures with only one entrance and exit. Because what are you going to do if you break out of your cell? Climb through a window? Good luck, fucker. And this remained the status quo for quite some time, with prisons continuing to develop into the Middle Ages, where prison towers, called donjons, became more common than basements. Why? Well, because a lot of fortified structures like castles already had towers they weren't necessarily using, and what the fuck are you going to do if you break out the window? They didn't have parachutes back then. But a lot of fortified structures with basements would still be used to house criminals because it was a lot more convenient than building an entirely new building for a handful of dick cheeses. Don't picture that for too long. But something else that became incredibly common was galley slavery. Now, while still a thing in the ancient world, galley slavery was the practice of having prisoners and criminals serve as the crew on ships as rowers. Because rowing a ship is fucking hard work, and also going out to sea for 90% of human history was a coin toss on if you'd come back. And navies, during the Middle Ages especially, were expanding and needed as many bodies as possible, and these useless fucks in the dungeon aren't doing anything anyways. And finally, in the Middle Ages, a lot of rules and laws around who could be imprisoned and why were extremely loose and dependent on not only the region, but the person whose land you're committing the crime on. Because sure, the King of France said, hey, lock thieves in the dungeon, but Sir Wife Cucker keeps his mistress in the prison tower, so he's going to chop your dick off and you'll probably die before anyone tells the king anyways. Less extremely, some landlords would reasonably be uninterested in putting people that are bad at rules in their basement underneath their house that is also stopping the crayon-eating British from stealing their children. But the point is that these specific rules, regulations, and specifics of punishments where you were said quite a lot about who had power and what that power meant. Like if your landlord locks you in the basement, clearly the man has room in the basement and is also very interested in presenting a strong face because, criminals in your basement is kind of a weakness of your defenses. But then this all changed ever so slightly in 1166 when Henry II had the first dedicated prison built in England and developed the idea of a jury trial as it appears in the West now. And for a surprise twofer from the shift farmers, in 1215 the Magna Carta was signed, which prevented people from being imprisoned without a trial. Yep. Before this, if you lived in the Western world, a rich dude could point at you and say, "Lock him in the basement, he fucked my horse," without a trial, despite the fact that he doesn't own a horse and you were a 7-year-old girl. Scary. But throughout the 16th to 18th centuries, it started to become common practice that instead of being sent to prison or corporally punished, whipped and beaten in the not fun way, you would instead be offered military service or penal, I know, colonization as a punishment. And why was this? Well, because prisons started to become overcrowded, also the Industrial Revolution started during this period, meaning that these prisons became increasingly shitty. On top of that, jails were private businesses, charging inmates for their basic needs and collecting fees from the government for housing their fuck-ups. All while, mind you, most of the people in jail or prison were literally just poor, and because of anti-poverty laws, and also the concept of debtor prisons, where you go to prison because you can't pay a debt, they'd be locked up without basic needs. Adding to the stress on the prison system, between the 17th and 18th centuries, the popularity of the death penalty and publicly beating the fuck out of people began to decline as public opinion turned against corporeal punishment. These people instead favored either releasing people who had committed minor offenses or imprisoning people with more serious crimes. And in response to all of that, the first correctional institution, Bridewell House for Corrections, was constructed. This institution was meant to punish and rehabilitate petty criminals, vagrants, and disorderly people like drunkards and feminists. They were often given grueling and long-shifted prison labor jobs that would toughen them up with the intention that they'd be more attractive in the job market from their jacked fucking bods and brains so stress-resistant that they can watch Marley and Me without crying, which is a feat. And then in England, in 1717, the Transportation Act passes, which was what I mentioned earlier, was shipping criminals to the colonies. However, for England in particular, this was an option for both lesser crimes or the motherfucking death sentence. Yeah, real good idea, guys. Violent homicidal maniacs you don't think should exist anymore, and a family of 8 that couldn't pay their taxes are both put on the same boat to Australia. But then in 1776, seeing as the Americans were doing a revolution, Britain takes this ball and goes home. The ball being all the people they don't want, and home being 2 other colonies that weren't rebelling. That'll fucking show them, Britain. Stop sending the Americans your death row inmates, and they'll totally realize this whole revolution thing is a bad idea. In the following year, John Howard, a sheriff and prison reformer, wrote the book, The State of Prisons. This book was a massive critique of the current prison system, and he was appalled that people were still serving time after being acquitted because they couldn't afford the jailer's fee. Or in other words, their release fee. He suggested doing the bare minimum to ensure prisons did their jobs, including individual cells, professional government staff, external inspections, and reasonable living conditions with healthy food. Yeah, all the way back in 1777 this was being said. And in response to this well-worded plea, the 1779 Penitentiary Act was passed, which introduced things like solitary confinement, religious teachings and lectures, and harsh prison labor as the standard for prisons. Oh, and also it opened up 2 new prisons, his and hers. But luckily in the Western world, and in the US and Britain especially, care and rehabilitation became top concerns of the prison system in the 19th century, rather than just being a hole in the floor to throw your poor people and scumbags into. This was especially because people were starting to notice that solitary confinement and other punishments were really fucking prisoners up in the head. Also during this time, our collective boner for the death penalty hits the post-nut clarity phase, and executions see a sharp decline as prisons begin to focus on the ideas of observation, monitoring, and incarceration, instead of beating the fuck out of people and hoping that they didn't kill themselves. I mean, revolutionary shit, huh? But also between the years of 1788 to 1868, after a long pause to the prison colony programs, Britain sees a new landmass and diarrheas white people all over Australia for the better part of 80 years. And if you're in prison during 1850 in the West, good news. The jailer fees become abolished, and now you don't have to pay for the guard to slip his key into the door and let you out. But by the end of the 19th century, a lot of the Western world is kind of prison horny, seeing prisons as the big next step in reforming human culture and society, and also as the most humane thing you can do to a person that's done something wrong. And then the 20th century happens. See, beginning with the First World War and into other major conflicts of the early 20th century, the number of wounded enemy soldiers captured or found behind your lines or who straight up surrendered grew sharply, and prison camps became exceptionally common on all sides of every war. And due to the fucked up state of Europe after these wars, many of the soldiers in these camps were often left to languish for years, trapped in a prison that was meant to be temporary. And this put a lot of powers off the prisons because the conditions in these places were ghastly. On top of that, the public started to turn from the concept of prisons as their own loved ones languished overseas. And then World War II happened, and holy fucking shit, do I not have to tell you the prisons and prison camps were soured by this conflict. I mean, obviously, in addition to the internment camps in the US and Unit 731 of the Japanese, the most infamous are the concentration camps used by the Nazis, where just over 300 camps were used to kill somewhere between 11 and 17 million people, with 6 million of them being Jewish and close to 5 million being prisoners of war, and the rest being somewhere along the lines of leftist, ethnic, not straight, educated, Romani, and vaguely not German enough. And this sours the very concept of detainment for a lot of places in the world, and much of the West works to reduce the impact of prisons on their society. Oh, and then France got the memo that prison colonies are a bad idea in 1952. Fucking France. Every time. And then in 1991, the idea of probation is introduced in its modern form, being a system where people can be sent back to prison if they break certain conditions, often without much, if any, wiggle room. And by 2006, the number of prisoners worldwide is 9 million. But let's backtrack and go through US history. Beginning back in 1786, when Pennsylvania attempts to revolutionize the prison system by making convicts that didn't have the death penalty do public works projects like roads, forts, and mines to save money, and assumedly thinking it would work out in a similar way that it did for the Romans. But this backfired, as the prisoners often proved to be a little bit too disorderly, disorganized, and also not good enough at these jobs to make it worth their while. And also, as the public watched them break their backs at work, they didn't think, "You deserve it, scumbags," and instead felt sympathy for them. So 4 years later, in 1790, they reformed the prison system again to the Pennsylvania system. And this system stressed that the purpose of prison was to find repentance for your crimes and earn forgiveness from the Lord baby Jesus. So to do this, the prisoners were put in secluded houses of repentance due to their work, away from the prying and sympathetic eyes of the public, and forcing them to spend the rest of their time in solitary cells with nothing to do but read religious literature. And some of your ears have started bleeding, and I don't blame you. That sounds like what hell is. But by 1820, the US and its citizens were starting to lose faith in the concept of prisoners reforming and began to think of them less as people who made mistakes and more as sinners. This resulted in the development of the Auburn system, where prisoners weren't even allowed to talk while eating or working and were forced into solitary cells for long periods of time because they should be thinking about how best to apologize to Jesus Horsecock Christ for their sins. Which reminds me that I should apologize for calling him Horsecock. Anyways, in 1833, the US bans debtors' prisons, pretty fucking late into the era, and in order to make sure that poor people still get their butt widened by the economy, instead introduces bankruptcy laws. Oh, and then in 1835, the first women's prison is built. And despite briefly going uphill, things almost immediately slide back downhill again. Because by 1866, convict leasing becomes widely introduced. This means the government could sell prisoners to private companies as temporary laborers that would then work for free and have very little rights. Basically, slavery to electric whoopsie-doo. And then 5 years later, in 1871, the Supreme Court case, Ruffin v. Commonwealth, is decided on, with it being determined that prisoners are slaves to the state and therefore had no rights. And this remained the status quo for almost a century. fucking yikes. 20 years later, in 1891, the government passes the Three Prisons Act, which creates the federal prison system under the Department of Justice, and surprise, surprise, opens up 3 prisons. The US is very creative with these naming conventions. And in 1907, New York introduces the parole system, which seems like it'd be a good thing, right? But not really, because this introduces supervised post-release and parole revokement terms alongside things like sentence of leeway or indeterminate sentencing. Parole, by the way, is promising the government you'll be a good boy and they release you early. And from then to 1928, the practice of convict leasing slowly dies off, with Alabama being the last state to outlaw it, assumingly because they like still having slavery, but not technically slavery. To replace it, the US begins implementing the practice of chain gangs, where people are bound together by a heavy ball and chain to perform heavy labor like railroad construction and deforestation. 2 years later, the Bureau of Prisons is established and becomes responsible for managing all federal prisons and to ensure humane treatment and consistency with containment and punishment. And, keep in mind the number of federal prisons at that time was not especially large. But in 1934, they added one more, Alcatraz, which was intended to hold some of the most dangerous prisoners in the U.S. In the same year, Federal Prison Industries is established, a government-owned corporation established to help prisoners develop real-world skills and re-enter normal society. And I'm sure you already see a problem with that being a corporation instead of a government department or under the purview of the DOJ, but hey, you'd have more forethought than the fucking government in the 1930s. Then in 1940, not yet knowing about the extent of the concentration camps, the number of prisons and prisoners in the US almost doubles. And in trying to keep up, the BOP modernizes its practices for the first time ever, using prisoner classifications and security levels. Yes, everything I said earlier, not joking. Before 1940, if you fucked up, you're all going to the same fucking hole in the ground. Now, also because of the US, the North and South differ in how they handle prisons. See, in the North, prisons begin to adopt the correctional model, where they want to eventually put the prisoners back into society, while in the South, the pattern remained, fuck them, they should learn how to shoot the fucking cops. However, because it's 1940, this isn't exactly equitable. See, these programs were offered to people thought capable of reform, which meant oftentimes minorities weren't included. But in 1941, Attorney General Francis Biddle issued Circular Number 3591. Oh, sorry, you didn't know what that was? Well, take a seat, class, and I'll fucking enlighten your little baby brains. Kidding. This abolishes convict leasing for good and makes it entirely illegal, no matter how much you want in Alabama. The next year, all 50 states develop a parole system in some way similar to New York. And now we have our first big prison riot / rebellion to talk about. In 1946, we have the Battle for Alcatraz. Paul Coy, a bank robber, and 4 accomplices attempt to escape by taking weapons and imprisoning the guards on shift. Unfortunately, they weren't able to find the key to get out of the building because the dude that had the key flushed it down the toilet. I'm serious. So instead, they lock down the prison and start to threaten the hostages. And what did the US government do? Well, the only reasonable thing, and deployed the motherfucking Marine Corps to retake the prison. After 48 hours, they eventually did, with 5 people dead and 15 injured by the end of the battle. Coy and 2 of his accomplices, Kretzer and Hubbard, were killed in the fighting, and the other 2 were fucking gas-chambered while strapped in chairs right next to each other. Brutal. Unrelated to this, the medical model of prisons is adopted in 1959, where rather than seeing criminality as moral failure and deserving of punishment, the idea became that criminality was a disease you could cure, which include things like education and counseling. Sounds very nice, huh? Well, I mean, we'll get back to that later. By 1961, the BOP is trying out a pre-release system for juvie offenders to give them a better chance of surviving and not ending up in adult prison. This includes giving them clothes and teaching them how to be a professional, how to use a savings account, and finding them jobs. which is fucked up that you had to go to juvie for stuff like that, but progress? Now, this platter of not being a dickhead to prisoners is followed up by President Johnson signing the Criminal Justice Act of 1964, which gave legal counsel to people that couldn't afford it. You know, a basic American right we all have, the thing we're supposed to have in the Constitution. And this is then followed by the Prisoner Rehabilitation Act of 1965, offering furloughs, work release programs, and residential treatment facilities for people in prison. And by the mid 1960s, 42% of Americans were opposed to the death penalty. So, how did all of this get fucked up? Well, if you've been on this show before, the 1970s. Beginning with 1971, when Nixon, the bastard, declared the war on drugs, which swelled prison populations. Added to this was the Attica prison uprising, where 1,200 people held 42 hostages in their prison. And what did they want? Better living conditions and political rights, like the ability to vote in prison. Now, in response to these, in my opinion, reasonable demands, the US said, we don't negotiate with brown people, and invaded the prison, and in the confusion, killed 39 while the inmates killed 4. And the lesson learned from this? Prisoners are evil and will fucking do it again, so the medical model is abandoned in favor of the quote-unquote balance model, which emphasizes punishments, deterrence, incapacitation, and maybe just a tiny amount of rehabilitation. And then in 1973, the mass incarceration era begins with a piddly 161 out of 100,000 in prison. Rookie numbers. We'll get better. In 1974, the Supreme Court hears the case of Wolf v. McDonnell, and no, that's not furry porn, a class action lawsuit filed by a prisoner. And the ruling makes it so that mail between an inmate and their attorney are completely confidential, but that disciplinary actions are still allowed that might restrict access to their mail. Fucking yikes. 2 years later, in 1978, it is ruled that ignoring health and medical concerns of prisoners is a violation of the Eighth Amendment. You heard me right. Prisoners couldn't sue if the prison neglected their medical needs until 47 years ago. And if you thought things were getting better, then you need to stop hoping. This is America. We spiral downwards until we eventually kill ourselves at 35 or live long enough to become a fascist. In 1983, the prison system is in part privatized because CoreCivic signs their first contract with the DOJ to open a private prison. And here we fucking go. In addition, the era of Supermax prisons begins, or the Auburn System 2, feasting on poo as I call it, with the murder of 2 prison guards in the Marion, Illinois prison. This model of prison has solitary lockdowns for almost 23 hours a day with a single 90-minute period to eat and exercise. Fucking holy shit, is that bad for the human psyche. The next year is the Sentencing Reform Act, changing prisons away from rehabilitation and further towards containment. This act also allows for the review of prison sentences, meaning judges could change it, while also making federal charges determinate, meaning you can't change the sentencing conditions for federal charges. Holy fuck again. And finally, in 1989, California builds its first Supermax in Pelican Bay, where there's no cafeteria, no educational or enrichment options, and also no socializing. Which is, totally acceptable thing to do to human beings. A notably social animal. Jesus Christ. And now into the 1990s, where the prison population doubles again, and by 99, there will be 136,000 federal inmates. As the banana for scale, we currently have 159,070 federal inmates. In 94, the first federal Supermax is built, containing people like the Unabomber and Olympic Park bomber, as well as espionage threats. In the same year, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act is passed, which allocated $9.7 billion to prisons and also expands the motherfucking death penalty and minimum mandatory sentencing. On the good side, it does work to address hate and sex crimes, so there's that. Now, in 1996, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which makes me fucking puke my mouth for how manipulative parenty it sounds, denies federal benefits to people convicted of felony drug offenses, which is carrying stuff like, weed. So further punishing the poor and also making getting out of the prison system a lot harder than it already is. Now finally we get modern-ish, beginning in 2002 when the Life Connections program is founded, which is a faith-based residential program designed to teach prisoners moral values, scripture, and give them a post-release community. Which, hey, that's good, but also can we fucking stop with prisons and Jesus, please? In 2005, in addition to there still being 40 Supermax facilities, U.S. versus Booker is ruled on, striking down the requirement for federal judges to follow federal sentencing guidelines, effectively meaning that a minimum of 10 years on your drug sentence isn't a guarantee anymore. In 2009, the prison population reaches the fucking astronomically high number of 2.3 million people in prison. Good fucking god, that's too high. And now with some Obama updates, in 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act passes, which raises the amount of crack cocaine required for a 5-year minimum sentence, making the playing field more racially fair. And then in 2015, Obama becomes the first president ever to visit a prison when he toured El Reno prison. Basically, as soon as he stepped outside, he goes, shit's fucked, and calls for prison reform to make it livable and provide better opportunities. And then in 2016, it's found out that despite what's advertised, private prisons are significantly more violent and unhealthy than public prisons, which that's not great in the first place. And it's discovered that private prison guards are taught to not intervene in prisoner violence. Why? Liability. Oh, and also there's discussion about bail being in violation of the 14th Amendment because people might be too poor to pay bail, but who gives a fuck about that? It's Drumpf time, baby. And in 2018, Trump signs the First Step Act, reducing mandatory minimum sentences related to non-violent drug offenses, eases the 3 strikes rule, basically if you commit more than one felony, you're fucked like a horse dildo, and open up new rehabilitation options. And hey, if this was his idea, good on him. But I do kind of doubt that. Regardless, this is a good thing, and even a broken clock is right twice a day. We're just waiting for the second time. And finally, before we hop out of this timeline, 2020. COVID got its dirty nutsack all over the prison like I did to your mom, and prisons are slammed, like your mom, for being overcrowded and unsanitary, like your mom. In response, prisons released thousands of inmates to save them from dying of COVID. And with that, let's get the fuck out of this timeline. Alright, so before we talk about the problems plaguing the prison system, I want to walk you through what the experience is like. Now, this isn't an admission that I've been to prison, but the fact that you weren't surprised, I think, says a lot about me. So, from the beginning, let's say that you've been sentenced. Well, then you'd be sent to county jail to await being taken to a prisoner intake facility. And how long does that take? Oh, not that long. Maybe a few days, weeks. Oh, or sometimes up to an entire fucking year. Now keep in mind, this isn't a facility meant for long-term human storage. This is a place that houses you while you're waiting for other shit to happen. Meaning it's not very comfortable. But this is as cozy as you're going to get through this whole process. So then, after maybe a year, you're loaded onto a bus with no real understanding of where exactly you're going, with the security on the bus more to make sure you don't get out than making sure everyone's safe. If you've studied history, this is fucking terrifying. But it's also terrifying because the place you'll be going to now is an intake facility, which from what I've read, sounds like a combination human processing factory induction center Pizza Hut at the strip mall that does karate on Fridays. So you're brought in, immunized, interviewed at a desk, and recorded as being present and accounted for. The whole time in a place that just oozes danger out of the walls, like I ooze sweat standing within 100 feet of someone pretty. And not only is everyone on edge, but the staff has been going through this process every day for the last who fucking knows how long, and has seen it all. So on top of feeling instantly in danger and treated like a piece of meat, you're also basically being told that you aren't special or even interesting. But after this, you're then divided into one of 2 groups, going either in the dormitories for people that aren't very violent or aggressive and are here for the first time, or a cell if you have a history or record of violence, seem a little agitated, or the people at the desk recognize you. And then all you do for the potentially next few years is wait for a spot to open up in a prison for them to send you to. And once that spot opens up, depending on the interview you did earlier that totally just absolutely fucked you over, we'll put you into a prison of one of those 5 security levels. And then when you arrive, you go through another round of intake and then are sent to your housing where you're going to live most of the rest of your time. Now, importantly, you start serving your time immediately, meaning from sentencing to now, you might have completed your sentence. But what is prison actually like then? Well, imagine how a city works. Then condense that down into a single building full of people that are being punished for something, and you don't have any freedom to make any choices, and also around every corner is either a prison guard that is likely on edge or hating their fucking job, or both, or some form of monitoring system. For most people, your day starts exceptionally early, some prisons waking the prisoners up at 4 or 3 in the morning to eat breakfast and do count. A breakfast that, mind you, is shitty and terrible in almost every conceivable way and is also in short supply, and you have very little time to eat in a place where everyone is at. That means every prisoner. Even the ones that have a problem with you. Even the ones that have a problem with you that are also violent and angry and antisocial. Meaning that you need to eat fast and get the fuck out of there. Also, count is done by doing a head count of everyone in the prison until the number they have is right or they find a corpse. Yep, they will count and recount over and over again until they find the person or realize someone got out somehow, either by dying or escaping. And this is up to an hour where you stand with nothing to do and just wait while they count you over and over again, usually at 3 in the morning. Most prisoners will then do their prison job for most of the day, since prisons lean on the labor of prisoners to continue functioning. On top of getting very, very, very low pay, think like $2 or $3 a day if you're in a high paying job, you're also not given much, if any, breaks, and the breaks you do get are highly limited and closely monitored. After working from conservatively 5:30 a.m. to noon, you're allowed to eat lunch and then either go back to work or get some time outside, work out, or have some leisure. And in most prisons, lights out is generally around 10 p.m., meaning everything goes off. In most prisons, the place you're going to wish that you were at when lights out comes is in a cell because that's fewer people to worry about stabbing you. But if all of this doesn't sound like a nightmare, keep in mind that while you are intensely monitored at all times, you are also never safe. Prison violence is really common, and because the only chance of privacy is solitary confinement, you have zero time to yourself or with total and complete safety. The only exception is if you manage to have your own room, but this is usually going to be filled fast since prisons are constantly being refilled. Unless you make weapons, which can get you fucking slammed by the legal system, you're going to have no way to protect yourself. And all of this weighs heavily on your mental health. You're doing long hours in a place where you're a lone island in a sea of people that you cannot afford to trust, and you know they think the same about you. Work can often last 12 or more hours for nothing but scraps, and the guards and staff are constantly suspicious of you. And on top of this, if you didn't know it, boredom and ambient shitholeness really drags on the human psyche. And if you're doing the same routine of anxiety, boredom, and being in the midst of shit for years at a time, your brain doesn't recover from that. It changes your brain chemistry entirely to be in a situation like that, and boredom is your brain literally having nothing to occupy its time. And the brain is designed to be occupied. Being that most likely when you come out, you'll have experienced some form of trauma and have a hard time adjusting. And mind you, you've just spent some number of years locked away in a concrete box with no communication to the outside to a society that is built on constantly being in the know and involved in the rat race. Meaning you're now behind and have lingering trauma to deal with. And with that super depressing trip, let's get into some specific issues with the modern prison system. And while there is a lot more than this, for this episode we're focusing specifically on 12 of the biggest ones. So first we have recidivism. This is how likely an ex-con is to commit another crime and return to prison, and right now we have a fucking wild 43.5% recidivism rate as of 2007. which is the most recent stats I can find, unfortunately. Which, if applied to today's number of prisoners, would be 728,800 people returning to prison within 5 years of being released. Now, something to clear up quickly is that recidivism rates include some fairly innocuous things as well, or things aren't necessarily problems, but are still contributing to it. This would be stuff like imprisoned people that are likely to reoffend in the first place, like someone that's a fucking scumbag and loves it, or re-imprisoning someone for stuff like technical violations, like breaking parole. For the most part, there isn't much that we can do besides kill people that are scumbags and abolish the concept of parole. But both of those have their own issues, obviously. But, what else can cause a high recidivism rate? Well, having no real plan when people are released by just giving them a couple bucks and their clothes back will certainly mean people are coming back. But also stuff like having poor or no options for furthering their education, career, or seeking therapy, as well as being in a place that is extraordinarily unsafe for long periods of time and then giving them no time to adjust. When taking a combination, you're taking someone out of the flow of society and the changing times and then shoving them back into it with literally nothing to try and rebuild their life with. And on top of that, people who are career criminals or are deeply considering it are now brushing shoulders with other people who are career criminals or are about to be. Meaning people will start to get very familiar with each other. It might even influence someone to get into a life of crime when they otherwise wouldn't, because they know they're fucked when they get back to the outside and are just trying to survive. Now, related to that is that prisons aren't meant to rehabilitate people anymore. Instead, the purpose is to keep control of the prisoners and have command over the space. And this is born out of the prison riots of the 70s and 80s, which can come from a good place of ensuring staff safety, but rather than addressing why prisoners are mad, they've doubled down on suppression, including buying things like riot gear and prisoner suppression systems, but also designing the prison in a way that intentionally makes it hard to live in, but safer to work in. And again, I'm not saying the staff deserves to be unsafe, but that the people running the prison aren't looking to make it a safe environment for everyone involved. They're making an environment where Daddy Sam asks fewer questions when a riot happens. The third issue with the prison system doesn't actually have a lot to do with prisons themselves. Rather, it is the school to prison pipeline. What this refers to is a collection of hardline practices schools use that kind of, sort of, absolutely doom some of their students to going to prison. This includes calling the cops for things that ought to be internal issues like scuffles or bullying, because this can add to a student's record and make them miss school, as well as seeing a very disillusioning part of the legal system. All for something that should not only be the school's job to fix, but is also not something the cops are necessarily prepared to handle. This also includes zero tolerance for things like drugs, alcohol, and things that can be stretched to fit the classification of weapon. These can also cause students to be suspended, expelled, or even ousted from the public school system for a single offense. And now they have nothing to do, or when they come back, they're behind, and now what are they supposed to do? A 15-year-old is smoking crack, drinking at school, or building pistols in their garage, something is already incredibly fucked up, and you've just taken away the part of their life that isn't. All of this can send kids shooting down the pipeline of career fuckery or prison. Related to all the above is the issue of overcrowding. Combined with high rates of recidivism and the gradual increase in both sentencing length and conviction number, prisons are overwhelmed and have more people than we can handle. But, I hear you say, undeterred by the duct tape I put over your mouth, aren't our prisons at half capacity? Well, yes, but are you going to be the one that puts a minimum security chronic litterer into the maximum security hellhole sharing a cell with a sodomizing domestic terrorist because there's too many people in the minimum security prison? Or the opposite? Are you going to put a killer in with people that are in here because they download furry porn illegally? You can't very effectively mix a lot of prison populations. So, sure, we're at half capacity, but building new prisons or retrofitting existing ones to hold more people takes a lot of time and money. And speaking of money, the poor funding the prison system receives is another problem, because very rarely do prisons and the correction system receive more money than they have, and very often when Congress wants to give themselves a pay raise for the black market abortion industry they're practically entirely funding at this point, what's the first place they look to make cuts? Well, yes, women's health. But where else? Okay, yes, support for underprivileged and marginalized communities. Well, yes, but prison. Prison. That's what I'm talking about. Prison is third on the list. Fourth. Sixth is inmate violence and staff safety. In one part, because the constant stress of prison life, boredom, and overcrowding, and also because the prison system is almost entirely men that need some kind of mental or emotional support, and the violent offenders in prison, everyone's lives are put in the not so capable hands of the most dangerous motherfuckers in there. And why is that? Well, because the staff, for the most part, have their own issues and are also consistently around the prisoners, while the prisoners, obviously, are always around these people and have no means of self defense. This is especially true with prison gangs and protection rackets being very common, and in some cases actively encouraged by staff to keep the prisoners fighting amongst themselves. Huh, sounds familiar. I can't quite place where that tactic has been used before. Oh, right, the catalyst that seventh is the rise in contraband and the technological stagnation of prisons. And this is a double whammy. Because prisons don't have the tech that the modern world has, it's that much harder for prisoners to keep a finger on the pulse of the outside world. On top of that, because prisons don't have the funding needed to upgrade their security, it's becoming easier and easier to sneak stuff from the outside in, and oftentimes more and more advanced things, because it's easier to hide, because the levels of technology you can stuff into something you can keister, which is hiding something in your ass, by the way. Eighth is staffing issues. Prisons are dangerous and stressful work environments that pay shit, and for the most part, don't offer great benefits. This is especially true of staff like guards and other low level staff that don't necessarily require a lengthy process of education, interviewing, and hiring. So, what does this mean? Well, then, added to the violence, poor funding, and sheer mass of prisoners in prison, you're dealing with poorly paid and burnt out guards that are doing this because they're too dead inside to care anymore. This causes most people to leave or become ineffective empty shells. And even more terrifying, some people love being prison guards because they love this environment where they have immense, almost unchecked power. Regardless, both types of these guards become much easier to bribe and pay off and aren't nearly as trustworthy and also tend to be quite violent. Ninth is the fairly common practice of mental health incarceration. Essentially, people who need treatment for things like schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses in the general prison system, and or denying them treatment, makes them a lot less stable. I mean, who fucking knew, right? Well, if you do this to people and expose them to a ton of trauma, do you think they're gonna survive? I mean, if they do survive, do you think they're ever gonna recover? Much of the prison system as it currently stands doesn't have the money, time, or dare I say it, empathy to help people with mental illnesses in the system. 10th is the almost total destruction of your human rights, dignity, and civil liberties. Once you go through the gate, congratulations, you've lost your humanity. The lack of free spaces and safety, constant supervision until it matters, lack of entertainment or enrichment, and then being treated like an animal on top of it, creates a survival mindset that is hard to break. I mean, think about it. Humans are survival machines. We're only at the point of not everyone being in a survival mindset because we've made our lives better. But we're forcing prisoners to regress to that state, where any moment there might be a predator waiting to attack you. And this is, again, combined with intensive searches, body cavity checks, and solitary confinement and other punishments being fully recognized by psychology as deeply harmful to the human psyche, being extremely common in prison. And tell me, why do we expect people to come out of this okay? 11th, and if you didn't know about prisons, this is your trigger warning. The rates of murder, assault, and sexual assault are rampant in the U.S. prison system. In fact, this problem is so widespread that not only is the fear of being raped a thought in the mind of much of the near prison population, but is literally a type of joke that has been told for well over 50 years. A joke. People joking about prison rape is easily twice as old as I am. And again, oftentimes in prison, guards are advised to not intervene as to avoid staff injury. So largely, beatings, murders, and rapes occur in prison and nothing is done about it. And finally, but far from least, is extremely racist sentencing practices that cause minorities, but black Americans especially, have much higher proportions of a prison population than they should for the number of people of that demographic. While a lot of racists and Fox News talking heads, sorry I said racist twice, will often say that this comes from a criminal nature. And if you've listened this far, and this isn't your first episode, I think you know the truth. How our legal system works is built off of racism, and much of the continued suffering from minority populations in the US can be traced back to the legal system and racism within it in some form or another. And is prison helping? Fuck, no. You're taking people from communities that have historically struggled in the US and have generational trauma and putting them in the trauma box and then forcing them to go back into the communities before they can remember how to live life as a human again instead of a shit sponge. And this actively destabilizes and undermines these communities, and I cannot imagine that that is unintentional. Okay, but with all the problems listed out, what are some things that people think is true about prisons? How do we fix all this? And what does the normal person think of prison? Let's go to the opinions. Alright, so we're going to start with the myths. And we're going to talk about 9 in particular, so if your favorite prison myth isn't on here, cry about it and send me an email. Love you. So, first is the idea that private prisons are the primary and only problem. And while yes, private prisons are incredibly problematic because it introduces corporate greed and capitalism into a system where you receive money to house people that don't want to be there, the expectation is to eventually let them out, able to fully integrate into society. But the assumption for a lot of people is that the prison system is so fucked up because a significant number of prisons are private, which is not the case. Only about 7% of inmates, which is still 117,278 people, are getting fucked over, by the way, are held in private prisons. So for once, the problem isn't corporate greed, it's government fuckery. Which is great that the majority of problems in America can be summed up as that sentence. But regardless, private prisons are still a nightmare. Because these corporations that own prisons are trying to make a high profit margin at the expense of the people that they're housing and the government. Meaning it benefits them to have high recidivism, poor conditions, bad pay, and as few benefits for both staff and prisoners as possible while charging as much as possible. So is it still a problem? Yes. But the bigger problem is that America's prison system is a steaming pile of dog shit on the white carpet. An already stained white carpet, by the way. Secondly, that prisons provide free labor, particularly industrial labor. And now, while states do still use prisoners for a variety of state work, like making license plates and other state-sanctioned and assigned things like public works projects and cleanup crews, they don't actually perform labor for free for off-site work. In fact, you can't loan prisoners out at all. But prisoners still work, as we've seen. Where they work is within the prison they live in, doing stuff like sanitation, suicide watch, construction, teach and mentor other prisoners, and state contracts. And for these things, they usually receive very little if no pay, and do these things to help cut costs. Oh, yes, in some cases I'd be okay with this if it helped people to readjust to life on the outside and set them up with a guaranteed job in the prison work they were doing. They also were treated like employees with, rights. They usually aren't. Usually prisoners in these tasks just sign up or have them assigned, and there's no real benefit for them at all. Third, releasing drug offenders and not arresting them anymore would curb mass incarceration. Now, while I'm still heavily in favor of this because we need all the help we can get to stop this wave of mass imprisonment, and it would also do a lot for this country to slowly, and I mean slowly, become less racist, this actually doesn't help a whole ton. And because while yes, in the prison system as a whole, a lot of people locked up are drug offenders, only 69,000, nice, are locked up in federal prisons and are convicted, and on the state side, 132,000 are convicted. I mean, if we release all drug offenders who have been found guilty, we'd be releasing 12% of the prison population. But there's other bullshit keeping drug offenders in prison. Like, for example, if you're a drug dealer and afraid of a taxman, someone that robs drug dealers, running up on you, You'll carry a scary fucking gun. Why, what if the cops arrest you while you had a gun and drugs? Well, now that's a violent crime and you're off to prison for upwards of 20 years. So, well, yes, you're in prison because you dealt drugs. They can keep you on a technicality. And why would they do that instead of relieving the overcrowding issue? Well, my sweet summer child, because America is fucked more than a soft femboy at a gay anime themed orgy. Don't ask me what I just said. I don't know either. Alright, fourth is the idea that people are convicted of a violent crime because they physically harm someone. Now, this would make simple logical sense, right? You'd expect that in order to be convicted of being violent, you'd have to have been acting violently, right? Well, no. See, the line for a crime being violent is implied threat or application of harm or violence. Meaning that, for example, you rob a house while no one is home and you're carrying a pocket knife on you, and also you always have your gun in your car because you'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Well, see, that's a violent crime. Because carrying that knife and also having that gun in your car meant that if things went wrong and someone was home, the assumption is that instead of running away like 90% of burglars do, you go all Kratos and turn someone to pulled pork with a utility knife. Fifth is that people convicted of violent or sex crimes cannot be released because they are dangerous and reoffend. And again, as seen in the violent crime one, this isn't necessarily true. While there are absolutely murderers, rapists, brawlers, and flashers that would do it again if they had the chance, and a lot of them would also escalate, a lot of people convicted of these categories of crimes simply aren't like that. For example, if someone, when they're an 18-year-old hothead, gets in a fist fight and accidentally kills someone because they hit the person in the instant death part of the head, which does exist by the way, they'd be a murderer and they'd get sentenced. Well, I mean, does that sound like someone that's going to do it again? I mean, think about it. If you got into a fight as a teenager and killed another teenager, would you do it again? Or someone who needs to piss and the options are pee their pants or find a secluded corner and pee into a bush, and a cop just happens to pass by. Well, now they're a sex criminal. And are they ever going to do that again? No, because it was a one-time circumstance caused by poor planning, but now they're on the government website that labels them as a sex pervert without literally any context with their picture between a rapist and a child molester. I mean, obviously, I think some people are inexcusably violent or rapey, and they aren't going to reform. But most people who are in for violent crimes are in that position because they fucked up, and some number of sex criminals are sex criminals because the US doesn't distinguish the reason why your balls are out and cares only that they are. Anyways, six is that fixing the system will make crime worse because then people won't fear prison. And, man, this one's just a self report. The fact that the thing stopping some people from committing crime is the prospect of prison rape is fucking terrifying. It's like people saying the only reason why the streets aren't filled with Satan worshipping, husband cucking mass murderers is because of the Bible. Because think about it, most of the time people commit crime for one of a few reasons. Firstly, because they think that's their only option or they don't understand why what they're doing is wrong. Second, because they snapped and did something they regret. Or third, because they're a fucking asshole and they don't care. In all three of these cases, the fear of prison didn't stop them. In fact, that probably wasn't even on their mind, and in two of the three, they didn't really deserve to suffer. They need guidance. Guidance that they won't get without an updated prison system. Seventh is the idea that victims of crimes want harsh punishment, which isn't actually statistically true. You know what is statistically true? That most victims want the perpetrator to be held accountable and actually atone for their actions, but victims, because they know what it's like to be victimized, want the core problem to be fixed. You know, like how in the aftermath of mass tragedies, the majority of people who survive want to fix the issue instead of saying thoughts and prayers. Fuck you if you say that, by the way, you're not helping. But, anyways, in some cases as well, the victim wants the specific person that targeted them to get help to not do that anymore. Like someone who's the victim of a drunk driving accident. Most people wouldn't want the drunk driver to get their genitals ripped out as the newest form of government sanctioned torture. They want them to get help so they don't fucking kill someone next time. Eighth is that some people need to go to prison, get treatment, social services, or to get it through their head that they're a fuck up. And while yes, some people can be way too stubborn and set in their ways and a slap in the face from the legal system is the wake up call they need, how fucking good do you think the prison system is? We're not giving them social services or anywhere near adequate medical or rehabilitation treatment. In fact, in some cases, we're actively taking that away or denying it. Sure, do some people get clean in prison? Yeah, but over a pile of corpses of the people that didn't. So, no, prison is not the beacon of medical services and public welfare some people think it is. Alright, and the last myth we're covering today is the idea that community supervision reduces incarceration. Now, what this means is that the longer someone's probation, the less likely they are to commit a crime. Which isn't true. Because oftentimes, if you're on probation right now, your normal everyday behavior will probably send you back to prison. And you aren't someone that was dropped in the middle of a society you have a hard time recognizing after being in prison long enough to be permanently scarred by it. By having long probations, you don't reduce the number of people in prison, you actually end up increasing it. Because often you don't have multiple chances of probation. And a lot of the probation terms specifically have anti-drug, anti-alcohol, and even anti-minor infraction statements in them. So you can get a court for something minor and end up in prison again, and this time without the chance to get out before you serve your full time. Okay, so now that we've hopefully cleared up some myths, let's talk about solutions. And the thing with the most solutions, and the most concrete solutions as well, is the recidivism rate. Now, this is a big boy problem, as with the current system, a lot of prisons have become revolving doors of suffering where people keep coming back over and over again with no chance of success or help. So, we can begin by changing how we measure the success of institutions away from the number of prisoners they have and can keep control over and change it to how low their recidivism rate is. While times past, given the cellular nature of the US by almost every fucking metric, this would have been difficult at best. In the modern day, given the almost instant transfer of information and interconnectedness of the states and federal government, you could very reasonably support a database listing how well prisons are doing at this. And this simple metric change means that prisons are incentivized to get people the fuck out and to never come back again. Which is kind of the point, right? To reform people and make them fit in a society. And if included in private prison contracts, even by nefarious means, they need to try to address their recidivism, meaning that even if really scummy state governments like Florida and Alabama decide to give all their prisoners to a private company in order to torture a minority, the same benefits still might occur anyways. Now, the next step would be begin the process of rehabilitation and reintegration from the second they pass through the front gates. Because even the most evil capitalist swine dogs don't want people sitting in a box doing nothing all day like a lazy bastard. They need to be outside suffering to make Papa Business his fucking money. So if you start things to help people survive on the outside day one, they're more prepared when they eventually get out and can participate in society rather than struggling for years and eventually getting put back into the box anyways. Now, after that, begin to use supervision programs for low-risk inmates to acclimate them to life outside of prison and to acclimate outside life to them. You know, like the sniff through the door thing. Now, by doing this, you get them experience with the outside and start breaking down the prison mentality, or at the very least, giving them a mask to wear rather than having to adapt from nothing. This also allows social workers and other government workers to monitor them and help them to figure out how to avoid future crimes. It helps them with job searching, and it also helps them figure out ways to reintegrate themselves. And because think, it's a lot easier for both Jamie and the community if it's like, oh yeah, Jamie's out of prison. You know, the guy that picks up a pizza and soda at Figaro's every couple weeks? Instead of just suddenly there's a new dude out of nowhere that everyone knows just got out of prison. Okay, and the last step, assuming you did all of those other things, is to use the carrot and stick system. And again, do the rest first, you fucking scumlord. By introducing and using a system of gradually receding sanctions, you can give ex-cons clear guidelines to avoid repeating the pattern to get into prison, and by giving them rewards for joining the community, you give concrete incentive to do so and can also prevent them from falling back into old patterns. But, hey, let's say you wanted to fix everything else. Well, luckily for you, there's ways to do that. And let me tell you, most of these are equivalent of busting out the toolbox and industrial cleaning tools and actually fixing the shit you said you were going to decades ago. So, first is to eliminate prison as an option for low-level, non-violent offenses and shift some of the offenses over to the civil system rather than the criminal system. This would include things like drug possession, which we talked about in the drug episode, property damage, and disorderly conduct. Instead of prison ever being an option, if these shifted to civil matters, it would be a lot easier and more effective, since the solution would be fines or income garnishing, rather than simply putting someone in the naughty box of bad boys whenever they get wasted at Chili's and sing the national anthem on the side of the road while smoking a joint. Also, they shouldn't get in trouble for that. That's just American. Another way to start fixing the prison system is to actually modernize, streamline, and put effort into drug treatment, parole, probation, and therapy. Because what this means is that people get the help they need, and the people that don't need help aren't wasting their time or your time and resources to get something they literally don't need in the first place. This would also include monitoring people that need monitoring and trusting people that you can trust. I know, fucking wild, isn't it? But with how the system is, it seems really common to heavily micromanage literally everyone that leaves prison except for the people that really need it. Like, I listen to Small Town Murder. Great podcast, by the way. You need to go listen to it. That's required. And about half their cases is someone who's absolutely going to kill again, and you can tell 10 minutes in, and the prison system not only lets them out, but removes it from their record, and then also buys them a house or some shit, and is like, yeah, go ahead and buy a gun. That's totally fine. Speaking of which, another thing that you can do is make a distinction between people who made mistakes and people who are assholes, and begin to release people who seem ready to re-enter society and have everything lined up and their lives seem to be in order, and keeping the people who need to be punished in place. Because it's also very common for people who seem ready to enter society again in prison still, because the system decided that all people who commit X crime are incapable of reforming. And obviously, I still think that some part of prison is punishment. I mean, I am American after all, but if we want prison to be both punishment and reform, I think it makes sense that once the punishment phase is over and someone's ready to leave, we should just straight up let them. Now, we gotta audit and examine the prison system as well, and by and large, the entire justice system, consistently and reform the system where we see cracks before they become breaks. And fix the breaks that are already there instead of fixing it with duct tape, prayers, and spit with a surprising amount of sperm cells in it. And I don't just mean your average reforms that take half a decade to give prisoners a 100-calorie boost to their diet. I mean quick and drastic reforms. And obviously, while this comes with danger, hopefully we can find a way to invest enough into the system to be constantly checking that things are working well and protecting people and fix it if it isn't. But hey, it is America after all. Whenever we introduce something to create a quick fix, someone always abuses it to repress a minority again. So, I don't fucking know. Alright, and finally, just fucking fund the prisons. I don't have anything clever to say here. Just fucking do it because we have to. Okay? We don't have any other option. If we're going to keep prisons, we need to give them money. If you don't like that, maybe we should get rid of them. Sorry, that was a little bit too leftist. I'll back off and continue with the script. Alright, and with that, let's look at what actual humans think. And we're going to start with talking about beliefs around crime, in particular for this episode, how common it is. Because one of the biggest things that will clue you in to how willing people are to have a shit prison system is fear. People are afraid of a growing crime rate. They won't necessarily care nearly as much about the people suffering in the prison system if they believe that crime is increasing, because they don't want to actually put their money where their mouth is and risk the danger of letting some of those people out. In theory, at least. We'll see how that works out. So, overall, 78% of Americans believe that crime in the US is on the rise, with 56% believing that it's on the rise in their area in particular. Which, I don't know if I had to tell you, isn't true. Crime is actually on a sharp decline and has been for decades. While you can find particular years with spikes, overall the difference is that we see it more. And thanks, Zuck, you fucker. But despite that, 40% of the US population is still worried about crime and their general safety. And it might just be the anxiety talking, but I get it. Like, when I was a little kid, I had constant fear about my house burning down whenever we left for any reason. I mean, also, despite decreasing crime rates, 34% of Americans say there's more crime, and 48% says it's the same amount of crime. So if it's not to fix crime, what do most people say the purpose of prison is in the first place? Well, 46% answered that it's to get violent criminals off the streets. And two groups of 19% agreed that prison is meant to change the inmates, with one saying that the point was to teach them a lesson, while the other was reformation. And then finally, 10% see prison as a deterrent, which again, we need to watch that 10% of people. Alright, so all of that would kind of point to Americans favoring harsh conditions, right? Well, no. See, while 43% of people think prisoners have it too easy, 22% think prisoners are being treated how they deserve, fucking yikes, and 17% believe that their treatment is way too harsh, the actual data for prison reform is a lot more gracious than that. 72% of Americans think that the way to stop people from committing crimes is providing treatment, training, and proper resources, and only 25% think that making prison hell on earth does that. But that isn't all, since most people also have very gracious ideas around people's release and reformation. For example, 79% of Americans believe that it's a waste of time and money to keep people locked up that aren't a threat anymore. 75% say it's similarly a waste if they've made amends to the victims and the government won't do it again. 57% say if they're too old to reoffend, there's no point in keeping them locked up. And similarly, if they've aged out of their crime, then 61% of Americans think it's time to just let them go. And on top of this, most Americans, 76% of them, believe that most convicts can change and deserve a chance to be helped and quote unquote fixed, for lack of a better term. And unlike 39% of Americans, the majority of 58% disagrees that giving prisoners benefits or help disrespects the victim, which is they take the IC way too much. And also, 61% of Americans think that a violent criminal can change. How much lower is that than a nonviolent criminal? 1%. And 40% of Americans think that there are too many people in prison, compared to the 39% that either believe that there aren't enough prisoners or that everyone that deserves to be in prison is already there. But, I mean, that's just one factor. Let's also look at the prison population and sentencing. 71% of Americans are in favor of reducing the prison population. And no, not in that way, Texas, in the ethical way of letting them out of prison and not the 40 caliber reformation. And on top of that, 59% of Americans think that this would help communities as opposed to 34% thinking it would harm them. What about prison sentences in particular? Well, breaking it down, an average of 55% of Americans believe that sending someone to prison for a long time both harms the community and increases the odds they'll commit another crime, given that prison both hardens you and introduces you to a bunch of fucking criminals. Who knew, right? And on top of that, people tend to agree about 73% of the time that the reason people commit a crime again or end up endangering the community is because prison isn't actually treating the base cause of why they did the crime in the first place. And 59% of Americans think that reducing the sentencing would actually help the communities the people in prison are part of or are released into. Which again, makes sense. And then, of course, we come across treatment. Something that, if you'll recall from the drug episode, a surprising number of Americans fucking hate for some reason. Especially the ones that just want addicts to suffer like a bunch of psychopaths. But let's break this down in both the aspects of mental health treatment and addiction treatment. First, that someone either with an addiction issue or a mental health problem don't belong in prison and instead need some kind of program to help them. 75% and 84% respectively agree with this. If they commit a serious crime, what's better for the community then? Well, it now jumps to 81% for addiction and 90% for mental health. And finally, what about for the addict or mentally ill person? What's better for them? 61% of Americans think treatment for addiction and 87% think treatment for mental illness. And overall, 73% of Americans think that sending people to receive medical and psychiatric treatment are better solutions than sending them to prison in the first place. Now, don't get the wrong idea. This isn't like the tell me how you're feeling today while laying on a couch kind of psychiatric treatment. This is state sanctioned by hook or by crook, you're never doing that shit again psychiatric treatment. It's not comfortable, happy, or in many cases even necessarily humane, and is also questionably effective. So then, what do Americans think about the criminal justice system in general? Well, first of all, that 68% think that the entire system should be founded on the idea that no one's beyond repentance, forgiveness, and redemption. Which sounds pretty good, right? Well, it gets better because Americans are also very good at recognizing the system is racist. 55% will agree that a ton of racism got people in color in prison. 52% say race played a part in it. And 33% of Americans say people of color are treated fairly in the justice system. Now, let me just pause so you can laugh at them. Okay, and now that you've thought it over and done the math, no, I'm not dumb. These are three questions posed, and the average percentage of people that respond that the system isn't biased is somewhere in the low 40%. Which means, yes, listener, there is somewhere between 9 and 12% of Americans that don't think the system is racist, but that people of color aren't treated fairly. Yeah, figure that shit out for me. 55% of the American public also sees that the criminal justice system has problems to address right fucking now, while 36% says that we should eventually get around to fixing the entire system. And now, if you're either a math wizard or watching my every move to watch me fail, you'll notice a 9% gap. Well, that's because 7% of Americans think the justice system is working as intended. Yes, you heard that. 7% of Americans think that just over 1 million people locked up, almost half of them are going to be back real soon, and immense violence are all things we should be cool with in prisons. What the fuck? Oh, and that 2% said, I don't know, and then assumedly sniffed their taint scratching finger. So then what ruins all of this? What causes it to feel like there's a lockdown on doing literally anything about the dismal state of American prisons? And why does it feel like every turn there's another we don't call 911 household because they either really want to kill someone or they have ACAB on their Twitter bio? Politics. Yeah, you could guess we'd be going this way. Basically on a national stage, because felons can't often vote. Yes, that's right, you lose a fundamental right if you're a felon, and prisoners don't represent a population just rife for the picking, and in most states can't vote from prison anyways. Politicians ignore anything to do with prison while finding ways to finger the other side's butthole with their words. What this means for prison reform is that both parties love to tout it, but nothing actually ever happens with it. You know, like how a two-party system that is actually a one-party system because both sides have a vested interest in keeping us brokies poor and squabbling amongst ourselves works. Now, the primary difference in the politics comes down to how to reform the system. So on the left, the idea is that prison incarcerations don't work because you can't deter someone from doing crime if they really fucking want to do it. Justice is vengeance spelled backwards, and prisons don't help anyone. So their solution is to instead make people do mandatory help programs like drug treatment and therapy, preferably while also being separated from the reasons why they did the bad things in the first place. And oh wait, isn't this just prison but said in a different way? Okay, but on the right, the idea is that prisons and incarcerations work. It's just that we aren't using the system the way it's intended. Easy. That basically kicking the ever loving shit out of someone will eventually help them realize that what they're doing was a bad thing. So their focus is more on making the current system much more brutal, strong, and also, tackling the crime rate by doing things like having cops go to schools, tell children that they really don't want to have to shoot them or send them to the kidney shipping box when they're older. And, that's supposed to help, like, people become well adjusted. And, like a lot of other times we've talked about party lines, these really show the supposed values of either side of the political spectrum. I think more than other things, this also shows their horrific vulnerabilities. Like, while I generally agree with a lot of leftist ideas, I have the same critiques that a lot of other vengeful and spiteful leftists have. We are way too soft. Because, yes, the prison system needs to be a lot fairer and actually help people, but this denies that some people are just straight up assholes and always were and always will be. And these people sometimes decide that their favorite thing to do is kill grandmas and smoke crack in daycare. And that person needs to be punished, hard and mercilessly. While the vulnerability on the right is the assumption that old means good. But the thing that they forget is that while prison is a very old concept, for the most part, it was storage for people being used as something else, like keeping your executioners in shape or your slave force active. And it also assumes criminals are fucking dickholes that think the life is GTA and we're all NPCs to fuck over at a moment's notice. So they treat everyone convicted of anything like a fucking monster, which is also unfair and entirely untrue. But, before I keep spilling my own beans all over your face and chest, let's go to the soapbox. Alright, and now for what I think. Hopefully it's not a secret, but as I said earlier, I'm a vengeful and spiteful piece of shit that should never have power of any kind. But I still want to see people do their best and succeed in life and be happy with something fulfilling, surrounded by people they genuinely love. And what does this have to do with prison? Well, I think that prison should be the place for people to take a break from life. I mean, obviously not by choice, but a place where you can get the care and help you need to get back on your feet and the means to do so. Honestly, I feel like not only should prison not be considered as the first option of punishment, but that for more crimes it shouldn't even be considered a punishment at all. Prison should be the toughest love available, that you've gone too far and you need to change before it kills you. And also that prison shouldn't be held against you, financially, socially, or educationally. But I still feel like we need a bottomless fucking hole to throw people in and be happy that they're in their suffering. Serial killers, rapists, sadists, and people that generally make both society and the world a worse place, like domestic terrorists, fascists, and plutarchal capitalists that think they can get away with whatever they want because they have money. People who are truly beyond one simple mistake or redemption deserve to suffer. And I know that makes me sound like an evil person, but I genuinely believe that, and I don't care if it does. Again, I'm a spiteful piece of shit and want people who are bad to suffer. But I also don't think that these two things are necessarily opposites. You can be kind and violent, gentle and decisive. And, I think that's what we need from the prison system. And where is a good start? Treating inmates like people. Rather than stripping them of their rights, constitutional and human, from the moment they enter prison, treating inmates like people that deserve respect and kindness until they prove otherwise is a good beginning. And if we start doing that, we can slowly begin to fix the broken, fucked up prison system. From there, we can fund prisons better. We can provide better benefits to employees and inmates alike. We can modernize, and we can begin prisoner integrations. Because when we see someone locked in a cage as a human, we want to get them out. We know how it would feel in that cage, and we learn that they don't deserve to rot in there. And on top of that, while by and large, prison and the justice system in general is used the fist of disapproval from society, as it has for centuries, if not millennia, that's not an excuse to use prison as a way to reinvent slavery. Because the US, ever since fighting a motherfucking war that ended, has tried to reinvent slavery so many times it's dizzying. And that's what the US is doing, using both prison and poverty to reinvent slavery. And hey, maybe if us white people got over ourselves for 5 fucking seconds, we'd realize how fucked up that is. So this is also a plea for us to cut it the fuck out and grow up. Alright, that's all I have. Let's get out of here. Alright, and there's episode 8 done. Fuck, I hope someone isn't using their prison bucks on this show. Anyways, as always, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, your rap sheet that landed you in women's prison, an official sentence to horny jail, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That is WAYTATPODS@gmail.com. Remember to check out my other podcast, WAYTAT Nerd, where I do basically the same thing, but with nerd topics like fantasy, sci-fi, role-playing games, etc., where I hope you'll like the topics just as much. And also remember to follow me on Twitter at waytat_pods for more episode announcements. Alright, have a good night, don't murder, have fun, and remember, tip your bunk mate. This has been Why Are You Talking About This? And I've been your host, William. Good night.